So I'll begin with a question this morning. When was the last time that you had great news that you just could not wait to share with someone? I remember when Jenny and I moved several years ago, we had lived in Lakeland most of our lives, and we felt God had called us to move to Plant City, which was not that far away, but we definitely were leaving our community that we were a part of and starting over somewhere else. And of course, amidst all the excitement of the ministry opportunities and the thing that God was calling us to do, we did need a place to live. And so we were looking for a house, and we just never felt settled, and it just seemed like the timeline was getting shorter and shorter, and we didn't want to rent if we could avoid it. And we had found this house that we thought, man, that would just be the perfect house for us. A lot of ministry opportunities. It had a barn, and we felt like we could use that for gathering people in the community and stuff. But there were just so many things that had to fall into place. One of them, it was not on the market at the time. It had been on the market. But it had been pulled off the market. We weren't sure why, and so I contacted the sellers privately through a letter, and just there were so many things. It was just from a human vantage point, there's no way it should have worked out. But I remember we had made an offer to the sellers, and we knew that we would be hearing back within a day probably, and just really didn't have our hopes set that high. We wanted faith. We were trying to believe by faith that God was going to work something out, but it was going to be. There was so many things he was going to have to do. And I'll never forget, I got the phone call from our realtor that the seller had accepted our offer. I just couldn't believe it. I just kind of sat there. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And Jenny happened to be in the shower. And so the anticipation of just that few minutes of just waiting, I could not wait to tell her. I was just like anxiously, man, she's not going to believe this. Like I was so excited to tell her. There was so much joy. And so when was the last time you had that kind of anticipation and joy waiting to share good news with somebody? Or think about how much of a fun it is to surprise someone that you love with some well-kept secret, like a gift or a party. And by the way, don't tell me anything. I'm notorious for ruining surprise parties. I think I'm like 15 for 15 on that. It's not good. But that's also a fun thing, an exciting thing to know there's a secret and you can't wait to share it with somebody. But it's also a gift that you might have things that you're passionate about, that you like to talk about and share with other people. For me, that's fishing or tennis or hiking the Appalachian Trail. I want to be a good conversationalist, and most of the time I'm fully engaged. But if I'm ever drifting and then one of those topics comes back up, I'm back in. I'm ready again. I'm engaged in the conversation because those are things I love to talk about. There's no effort. I don't have to have a strategy for that. It's just pure, effortless enthusiasm to talk about those things. And we all have a passion or an interest or a pursuit that we can easily talk about with enthusiasm. For some of you, it might be cars or vacation spots. It might be the series maybe that you're currently streaming. Might be social justice causes or political views, right? It doesn't matter. Someone brings up that topic and you're all in. You're excited that you don't have to generate enthusiasm. It's just there, and now you have the opportunity. So sharing our enthusiasm or excitement with others is a good thing, and when it happens naturally, when there's no effort required. So here's a question. Would we say the same thing about sharing our faith with others? Is there the same kind of anticipation and joy and this kind of effortless expectation that I can't wait either to speak about or to demonstrate or to have the opportunity to show the thing that is most important to me, which is my faith? As followers of Jesus, we have good news to share about God's love. In fact, it's the greatest news. It is the profoundest of news that has the potential to transform lives now and for eternity. And here's a humbling reality. God has entrusted everyday people like you and me with this incredible, eternity-changing news for our friends and our neighbors. Think about this. He has no plan B. We are his plan A, and he has no plan B. That's just the way that God designed it in such a way. We talked about this with the children a little bit, that God sent Jesus, and then Jesus sent us to share that good news, to demonstrate that good news, to make it our passion and our joy, to demonstrate it in a way that people can see who God is and what he's like. So how do we embrace the privilege of sharing the good news of God's love and his rescuing love with joy and enthusiasm? Well, today we're continuing our series that we started last week called Finding Joy, and it's in the book of this Paul's letter to the Philippians. And so let me just give you a brief recap if you were not here last week. So the author of this letter that we're looking at in the New Testament was named Paul, and he was a missionary, evangelist, he was a church planter. He himself was a Jesus hater. He was someone who actually wanted to oppose the message and the cause of Jesus' followers until he himself had a profound encounter with Jesus. And it transformed him and it changed him, and he became a missionary and a leader of the Christian movement in the first century. And he would go to new places and he would share the message of Jesus with people however he could. And when people became followers of Jesus, he would start a little church in that town or that city, and then he would move on. And so he started a church in the Roman province of Philippi. And then 10 years later, while he was imprisoned, possibly facing execution for his faith, the Philippian Christians heard that Paul was in prison. And so they gathered up a financial gift and they sent it through somebody named Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus travels all the way and delivers this gift to Paul as an encouragement to him, that he's not alone, that the people who love him are supporting him. And then Paul writes this letter back to the Philippian Christians. And so this letter that we have in our New Testament called Philippians is a letter that Epaphroditus takes back to the Christians in Philippi from the Apostle Paul. And last week we looked at the intro to the letter, and the big idea was that Paul derived an incredible amount of joy from his relationship with the Philippian Christians and his partnership in the gospel. That was the big focus that we looked at last week, that there was this sense that Paul and his relationship with the believers in Philippi, but also the Philippian Christians and their mission to the other people in Philippi was a partnership of mission and ministry that they shared. And so this week we're going to pick up where we left off. And in the passage that was just read to us, Paul's reflecting on his predicament. What he summarizes with phrases like, "What has happened to me?" or "I'm in chains," or "my chains." So Paul's literally talking about and describing that he is in shackles and chains in a Roman prison. He's been stripped of all of the freedom that he enjoyed to share the message and the mission of Jesus. And he's awaiting a trial that could possibly end up with him being executed. In fact, that's where we're headed in the next few weeks, is Paul reflecting on the fact that this might be it. His sharing the message and the ministry of Jesus may have very well cost him his life. But on top of all that, Paul's being sidelined. And the fact that he's being sidelined created a bit of a leadership vacuum in the Christian movement. And other people have stepped up to lead and to preach, which is a good thing. But some of them had twisted motives, and they wanted to undermine Paul, and they wanted to make a name for themselves. So he's reflecting on all these things, and he's sharing this with the Philippian believers. And he wants them to know something. You can see it in verse 12. He says, "I want you to know something. I want to reveal something to you. I want to disclose something. I want to pull back the curtains into my heart and my mind about how I'm processing my current situation." And what Paul tells them reveals Paul's personal hierarchy of values. Now, we all have a hierarchy of values, and that determines everything. It determines how we think. It determines how we interpret reality. It determines how we spend our money and how we make decisions and how we react to various circumstances. Your hierarchy of values determines how you set and maintain your priorities. Now, for most of us, they are unconscious. But your hierarchy might include things like friends or family or comfort or security or safety. It would include your faith. It would include maybe church involvement and social media and social status. It might be your marriage. It might be patriotism. It might be a sense of civic duty or sports or hobbies or adventure or fun. We all have these values. But we don't all value these things in the same way, so there's a hierarchy or a ranking of those values. You may value sports, right? But if you value your marriage more, you might decide to skip the hockey game and go on a date with your spouse, right? You value both things. So it's not a question of should I value one or should I value the others. What happens is the thing that you value most will usually determine your decision making. So what you value will always influence your decision making, and your decision making will always reveal your values. Now think about that for a minute. Your values will shape your decisions, but your decisions are also a way to read into what do I actually value. In other words, it's easy to say, well, I value this, or I prioritize this, or this is really important to me. But if you want to know if that's true, look at the decisions that you make. Look at the way that you plan your calendar or you spend your money, because that tells you what you actually value most. And as Paul talks about the loss of his freedom and his reputation, his comfort and his safety, all of these things, if you were to say, hey, Paul, do you value freedom? I'm sure he would have said yes. Paul, do you value convenience? Would you like to not be in prison? Would that be more convenient? He would say he values all these things, right? But it becomes clear that there's something that he values more. And that's found in verse 12, the advancement of the gospel, which basically means that the good news of Jesus' message and mission is being advanced. That has not stopped. Paul's imprisonment has not stopped the message of Jesus moving forward and people coming to trust in and experience the life-transforming power of following Jesus. That has not stopped. That is not changed by Paul's circumstances. And so he wants them to know the advancement of the gospel is still happening. It is still being made known. It's being revealed. It's spreading. It's getting airtime. It's getting the exposure that it deserves. And people are experiencing the love of God in transforming ways. That's Paul's highest value. That's his preoccupation. It's his passion. It's his joy. It's the value that's at the very top of his hierarchy. And because he values the advancement of the gospel more than his freedom, more than his comfort, more than his safety, more than his reputation, he's able to see through his predicament with a different filter, through the eyes of faith. And he's somehow able to find joy in his chains. So Paul's decision to advance the cause and the mission of Christ, even when he knew it would get him imprisoned, possibly executed, was like a rock in the pond. And the ripple effect was significant. What had been the impact, and you can see it begins to cascade as Paul then begins to explain. How is it that he knows that the gospel is advancing and the message of Jesus is still moving forward even though he's in prison? How does he know that? And he begins to describe it. In verse 13, he says, the palace guards had taken notice that Paul was in chains for the sake of Jesus and his message. So Paul's noticing that even as the guards are watching him and guarding him, he's noticing that they are noticing why, which means there probably were conversations where they were just engaging with him. Why are you here? What is this issue? Why are you a threat? What is going on? Why would you not, disown your faith and just walk away? Why is this so important to you? Why is this Jesus person so precious to you that you would be in prison and risk execution? Paul says the palace guards are beginning to take notice of his faith. He then throws in a little bit of a general phrase, but it's an important one. He says, everyone else has also taken notice. So who knows what that means? It could be his network of friends and associates and people coming and going. It could be other people in the palace guard that maybe we're finding out. But he said other people have taken notice. Verse 14, he says other believers were emboldened. In other words, as other believers saw Paul get arrested and stay arrested under the threat of persecution, maybe imprisonment, and then ultimately execution, and not give up his faith, it's as if other people's faith that was a little timid, a little shaky, it rose up. And they were just like, wow, he believes this. Like, this is real to him. And so it emboldened the faith of other believers who became courageous, and it also became contagious, right? This is what Paul's watching happen in real time. He also says that other leaders had stepped up into the leadership vacuum that was left by Paul, and they began preaching Christ. And the minute you believe that he's starting to say something negative, because he says, yeah, other people have come up and stepped into this leadership vacuum, and they're preaching Christ, but their motives are twisted. They're doing it for selfish gain, maybe monetary gain. And then the minute you think Paul's shifted negative, he then ends by saying, but I don't care about the motive. Christ is being preached. That's all that seems to matter to him. And so he ends it by saying, so I rejoice. Once again, in prison, in chains, awaiting execution. And when Paul reflects on all the things that God's doing to advance the gospel, despite his situation or through his situation, he says, that brings me joy. I can't even contain it. I'm rejoicing in prison because the gospel is advancing. Now, reflecting on this passage led me to ask two questions that I hope maybe will help us to apply this passage. First question is this: how much do I value sharing the message and the mission of Jesus through my life and through my story and through my acts of love and compassion and by being a good neighbor and just paying attention to people in my everyday life? How much do I value that privilege that I have? One of the mistakes we could make is to draw too sharp of a distinction between Paul and ourselves. That can be a challenge sometimes. So we're reading this letter and we're like, okay, he's Paul. He wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. He's an apostle. He had this profound encounter with Jesus. And so, of course, he's going to take great risks and impact the world in the way that he did. But you can't expect just normal, everyday me, Christian, to emulate that in my life. And on one level, yeah, Paul had a unique experience and a calling. He was gifted and he was deployed by Jesus to pioneer new territories and to preach the gospel and to start new churches. That was Paul's unique assignment. And he was given grace for that assignment. But as we'll see in this letter, Paul very much assumes that the Philippian believers, a community of normal, everyday Christians who share the same basic values and the priorities of Paul, are part of a larger mission of Jesus. That's what he assumes. So he doesn't share these things because he wants to say, hey, look at me. Look at how unique my story is. The whole fact that he's sharing them with this community of Christians shows you that he wants this to spread. He wants this mindset to be shared so that the way that they're going to participate is by the lives that they live together. Their witness in Philippi, their generosity to missional causes, and that sort of a thing. But the basic impulse and value of wanting other people to experience the gospel and to know God's love through Jesus was something that they had in common. Remember what he said in the opening verses that we looked at last week. He says, I find joy in the fact that we have a partnership in the gospel. That the gospel is advancing through me, and it's advancing through you, and it's spreading in Philippi, and it's spreading throughout the Roman guards. He says the gospel is moving forward by everybody who's willing to just say, God, I don't feel uniquely qualified. I don't feel like in and of myself I have what it would even take, but I just want you to know I'm available. If you will use somebody like me, I'm available. And I would get excited about that. I would get passionate about that. And that's Paul's expectation. So no, most of us are not called to full-time ministry or mission work like Paul. But if you're a follower of Jesus, he wants to advance the gospel through your unique web of relationships, through the patterns of your normal everyday life, whatever stage of life you might find yourself in. God has a unique assignment. He has unique ways he wants to use you. And it should feel like a privilege, like an adventure of faith every day. It's a passion that should be woven into the unique callings that each of us have. Some of us as fathers or mothers or grandparents or teachers or plumbers or business owners or students or athletes or artists. We should wake up every morning with this anticipation, with this prayer that we say, Jesus, I have no idea. I have no idea how you might want to use me today to love someone, to serve someone, to speak a word when I need to, or to have an act of kindness or compassion. I don't know what you might have planned for me today, but I just want you to know I'm available. I'm in. I'm going to be looking. I'm going to be paying attention. I'm going to be watching to see how your plan unfolds for me today. That's how it should feel when we think about the privilege of God advancing the gospel through our lives. Now, how do we get there? How do we see this value increase in our lives? I asked the session a few months ago, we were kind of talking about this whole idea of sharing the gospel and caring about people who have not yet experienced the gospel. And I just said, I want you to think of it like a thermostat or a number system, and 0 would be like, it doesn't even cross your mind. You have zero compassion for people who don't know Christ. It never crosses your mind that they would spend eternity apart from God. And 10 would be, you're the Apostle Paul, okay? Like that's what you think about, that's what you're passionate about every day. Where would you place yourself on the scale? And it was just a way of saying, not to shame anybody or to make you feel guilty, but just to say, hey, be honest. Just be honest, because God can't change you if you don't at least acknowledge where you are. So if we want to see this value increase in our lives, it starts with a humble assessment. God, this is where I'm actually at. I don't have the kind of compassion that I wish I had. I don't see people. I don't think about my every day as a mission, as an opportunity for you to use me. At least begin there and confess that to God, and then ask him to change your heart. Pray for a deeper awareness of the gospel in your own life. Right? What happens is when we sing a song like Amazing Grace, here's what ought to happen. We sing that song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Like what happens is we should say that, what an amazing, that's my story. That's what God did for me. And then the next impulse ought to be, and that's what God wants to do in my neighbor's life or in my coworker's life. And my heart breaks until that happens. You see, that ought to be it. But sometimes what happens is we become a dead end for the gospel. We hear the gospel, we experience the gospel, we come every Sunday, we sing about the gospel, we celebrate the gospel, we enjoy the community of the gospel, and we forget that the gospel was for us and it's on its way to somebody else. See, God's love is always for you to change your life, but it's always on its way to somebody else. So we want to be conduits of God's grace, conduits of the gospel. We want it to impact our lives, but let it pass through us to others. And so pray for that deep awareness, that desire that you would want to do that. And pray that God would increase your love and your compassion for people who do not yet know his rescuing grace. And then just pray, God, would you give me one or two people in my normal everyday relational network who I know doesn't know you yet. They've not experienced your life-changing grace. And just ask for new opportunities. Say, God, would you just show me new opportunities to just engage in conversations that matter, to serve them in some way. Maybe, God, just reveal some way that I can practically love them and pay attention to what's going on in their life. And let that be your continual prayer. And then celebrate the small and the big opportunities that God gives you to be his witness and to demonstrate his love and to share your faith. So that's the first question. Second question was, how often does your faith require faith? When was the last time that you risked something, you attempted something, you sacrificed something for the good of others out of love and devotion to Jesus, and you thought, this is crazy that I would do this. Like, this is so risky. Like, I'm out on a limb. Like, I feel like God's asking me to do this or to love this person. Jesus is asking me to risk this or sacrifice this or financially contribute in this way that other people would just say, that's a little bizarre. That's a little crazy. Like, your faith, in other words, that you actually are exercising faith. Because that's what faith means. Faith means you're putting yourselves in situations that if God does not show up, it will fail. Whether it's an attempt to love somebody, so maybe it's a stand of obedience in the workplace or on social media or in your friendships. Maybe you begin to pray for an unbelieving coworker and the opportunity to serve them or love them or possibly shift the conversation towards things of faith. Maybe it's a choice to financially give to some cause or a person that's going to mean sacrifice. It means you're saying, I had set this money aside to go on a personal vacation with my family, but I feel like God's asking us to give this money to this ministry. See, that requires faith. That's not something you would just do in the natural. That requires the eyes of faith. Maybe it's a difficult conversation to speak the truth in love. Maybe it's a choice to confess a secret sin battle with someone that you feel you can trust to gain some accountability. Or maybe it's a commitment to practically love someone over the long haul. See, all these things require active, everyday faith. And I think there's a rampant boredom and indifference among Christians, partly because we've settled for a version of the Christian faith that does not require any actual faith in real time. It does not take faith to go to church 3 out of 4 Sundays a month. That's not faith. It can be. The root motive for that might be faith, but that doesn't cause you to I'm taking a really bold, courageous step. I'm going to wake up and go to church today. Following Jesus calls us to risky acts of love and service that require courage and humility and bold faith. But if you never allow his call to love others, to put you in situations where you're going to be over your head unless he shows up, then you're never going to experience in real time him showing up in a way that you just have to acknowledge and just say, I don't know how only God could have done that. But if you don't put yourself in those situations where you're going to be able to say only God, you can't then complain and say, well, my faith just feels kind of boring, kind of mundane. I don't know. I read the Bible, all these miracles, and God does all this neat stuff. I don't ever see that in my life. Because you're not taking any steps of faith where he could show up with a miracle. That's what the life of faith calls us to. The times of my life where I've been most complacent, most irrelevant in terms of my faith have been the times when I've just settled and I'm playing it safe and I'm just doing the normal Christian thing or the normal pastor thing, whatever that is, right? And I'm stopping that idea that every day is an active opportunity to trust him. So we can't orient our lives around self-interest and safety and comfort and convenience and then complain about losing interest in our faith or our faith being boring or irrelevant. Of course it is. You've not embraced faith. You've embraced a little bit of a religious lifestyle of safety and convenience. It might be a life of religion or church attendance or morality or being a good citizen, but it's not a life of active participation in Jesus' mission and the bold faith and courage that mission requires. So abandon the religious life and start following Jesus. Start following his way of life, and then your faith will blow up and come alive again. Paul was living by faith, and that led him to love people in ways that were risky and sacrificial and costly. But as you read Paul, as you listen to his words, do you get the sense that he's disappointed? Do you get the sense that he's second-guessing? I don't know if it was really worth it. Now that I'm in chains, now that I might be executed, I don't know. Now I'm really second-guessing. Does he sound like he regrets allowing God to use him to advance the gospel? In no way. He is in chains in a Roman prison, and he cannot stop using the word joy or rejoice. Like I said last week, he uses that word 16 times in this short letter. This is a man who's lit on fire by the joy of the privilege of following Jesus. He's calculating all the good that God's accomplishing through his life, and he's rejoicing. If you follow Jesus, and if you love people, and you take great risks for God, it is always a net win. It is never a loss. You will never regret offering your life to God to advance the gospel. Some of you may have heard the account of Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot, his wife and his son, along with 4 other families, they felt compelled to be missionaries to the Huaorani people in Ecuador. And so they spent months learning the language and the customs. They made all this preparation, trying to get the best information they could about these people who lived in a very remote area of Ecuador. And they were praying for the opportunity to connect with them in some way. And so Jim was a pilot, and they realized that they had a certain flight pattern that they could take, and they would drop gifts. They would lower gifts down to the people, and they hoped that this would build good rapport, that this would show that they're there not to harm them or to hurt them in any way, but they're there to show kindness to them. And so finally, after doing this in several ways and really praying about the opportunity and trying to look for this window that they might have to finally connect with the people of this tribe, Jim and 4 of the other missionaries landed on a small strip of land in a river basin near the tribe. And they had hoped that these gifts that they had delivered in their presence would be a clear sign of goodwill and the beginning of maybe a new friendship and new relationships where they eventually could share the gospel. But instead, a few of the Huaorani tribesmen attacked Jim and his friends and killed them on that landing strip. Jim's wife, Elizabeth, was heartbroken, but she believed that God had called them to these people to reach them with the gospel. So after she grieved and struggled with that and really prayed and discerned what God was asking her to do, she regrouped, and her team was able to then establish a connection with the Huaorani people and saw many of them come to trust in Jesus. And then eventually there was a church started there, and then a school started there, and then a medical clinic, and it became an outpost for the message of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. Before Jim passed away, he was asked about the risky nature of the missionary work. And the decision to take his family to Ecuador, the people who loved him and were close to him were just kind of like, that seems like a very dangerous thing to do. You sure this is what God wants you to do? This could be very costly for you. In fact, it did turn out to be very costly for him, implying to him that it was foolish. And this is a quote. He says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." I want my life to be marked by seemingly foolish decisions to befriend and to love and to sacrifice for people who otherwise would never know the Jesus who changed my life. Mother Teresa said this. She says, "In life we cannot always do great things, but we can do small things with great love." I want to be part of a Jesus community that's known for doing small things with great love. And that's the invitation to us as a church. That FPC, wouldn't that be great if we were known in the community? That's a church that does small things with great love. What a privilege that would be. What a joy that would be. That's the adventure that God is calling us to individually, but that's what God's calling us to as a church, to embrace the privilege of embodying the gospel, sharing the gospel, demonstrating the gospel, showing the good news of Jesus in ways that are going to be inconvenient, in ways that are going to be sacrificial, in ways that are going to be uncomfortable for us. But he's calling us to faith, because Paul is inviting us to say, you want to know where your joy, if you've lost your joy, you want to know where it's hiding on the other step of an incredible act of obedience that requires faith to love other people. And that's the invitation. So I want to ask you to take a few moments to pray, just to respond. What is it that you feel like God has spoken to you through his word this morning? And just take a few moments and respond to him in prayer before we sing our closing song.